was teeming and vast, but its pockets of green offered space to breathe and time to stroll. Mumbai raged unharnessed. If you strolled, you'd be trampled or at least knocked over by a cyclist. Even the tendency towards idling was noticeably absent. In Mumbai, everyone meant business and the feeling was addictive. This was our second visit to Mumbai, and as the tide of commuters swept its way through the halls of CST, dragging us with it, a familiar thrill heated up my blood. Or perhaps it was just an early symptom of malaria. Mumbai was a city of dreams and a city of nightmares, of hopes and of horrors, and I hoped to find the latter on the spaghetti trails of its commuter trains. After 1 month of smooth rides and few delays, it was time for a journey that would spice things up a little. So far, everyone we had met had issued the same warning. Do not, in any circumstance, attempt to ride the local train. It is not for novices, which we interpreted as an open invitation to do just that. Mumbai's commuter train network, or the locals, is notorious for passengers compressed in the open doorways, grazing the roof with their fingertips, inches from certain death. During rush hour, a 9-car rake designed for 1,800 standing passengers can often carry up to 7,000, known as a super dense crush load. It was a suicidal exercise in survival that 7 million of Mumbai's workers were forced to endure on a daily basis, almost the population of Greater London. The vulnerable nature of their close proximity had made commuters the perfect target for terrorists who attacked in 2006, hiding explosives in pressure cookers that killed at least 180 people and injuring more than 800 in a series of 7 coordinated blasts at rush hour. Mumbai's local trains were certainly not for the faint-hearted. Footage of locals floating around on YouTube included a man falling from the doorway as the cameraman yelped in shock, but continued to film. Other clips showed passengers riding on the roof or stretched across windows like Spider-Man in flares and flip-flops. On 2 separate occasions, unidentified luggage left behind had been opened up to find not explosives or forgotten aloo parathas, but the body of a woman, one pregnant inside a suitcase on a platform, the other tied up in a sack and wedged under a seat. Discovering dead bodies was very low on our list of priorities, as was falling out of the door or falling victim to pickpockets and eve teasers. But ultimately, it was just a ride on public transport. How bad could it really be? While flicking through a magazine left behind on the train from Hyderabad, I had come across an article about a spa in the suburbs that had recently begun offering a form of ichthyotherapy. This was just one paradox of Mumbai. Most of its residents could not afford shoes, while the remainder would happily pay for imported fish to nibble dead skin from their cracked heels. The spa was in the High Street Phoenix shopping mall near Lower Parel, which presented the perfect excuse to test out the trains. At midday, we returned to CST. With its Pensant Point turrets, archways, and Victorian Gothic architecture, the sprawling structure resembled a cathedral rather than a railway hub. Originally named Victoria Terminus after Queen Victoria, its colonial ties were snipped in 1996, and it was renamed Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus after a Maratha warrior, though it was still fondly referred to as VT. It was now also listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Beneath the stained glass windows, swooping arcs and shitting pigeons, we scoured the signs for the train to Parel, from where it was a short walk to the mall. Lower Parel was on a different line, but chopping and changing was a little ambitious for the moment. A driver who had stepped down from his engine to stretch and scratch flashed a smile and pointed to his train to tell us to board. The carriage was wide and clinically clean, with rows of miniature ceiling fans blowing in sync. Lacquered seats waiting patiently to be filled, and a lady sat reading in a corner. She looked up, acknowledged us, and went back to her book. It was like being on a London tube, but friendlier and infinitely more hygienic. Train number 19 remained empty until it began to move, at which point a number of men leapt in with ninja stealth, slicked their side partings back into place, and sat down clutching carrier bags. This was not how a Mumbai commuter train was supposed to be. Covering the roof was a series of hooked metal handholds that gave the creepy feeling of traveling in a human abattoir. Passepartout stood in the middle of the carriage, swinging from one and gazing at the slums rolling past the doorway. Our Cold War had ended after he booked a surprise birthday apology at the Trident in Nariman Point, a victim of the 2008 Mumbai attacks. After 5 weeks, the first sight of a bathtub, the feel of fluffy robes and a flat-screen TV had calmed all anxieties, and we left rejuvenated taking the tea bags, apples, and coffee, and lingering in the lobby until the 24-hour internet had run out, along with the receptionist's patience. Nonplussed by the pleasant journey, we arrived at Parel and made our way through a fruit market, foggy with the warm fumes of jackfruit, and hopscotched across several dug-up sections of road to High Street Phoenix. It was a monster of a multiplex that housed names from Canali and Marks & Spencer to Armani and Accessorize, which sold the same stripy knee socks that I'd bought in High Street Kensington at Christmas. Clothes shopping in India had come a long way since the mid-90s trends of Vibe, Weekender, and Benetton. Upstairs, the spa was filled with giggling therapists in loose trousers, tickling one another. Dispersing in an instant, they bowed deeply, taking us into a back room with trickling water, a CD playing bird sounds, and a tank of fish darting around waiting to be fed. Sensing food was on its way, they spread back like synchronized swimmers and then shot forward, wriggling their way between toes and clinging to both heels. It was as though hundreds of electrical charges flowed through my soles, which was strangely relaxing until I realized how insanitary it was to stick my feet into a tank of water filled with numerous varieties of toe skin. I withdrew my now slightly smoother feet. Passepartout was enjoying a foot massage, and as one last indulgence, we stopped briefly at McDonald's for a McChicken sandwich, which, after many weeks of dosa, uttapam, and idlis, was like heaven in a sesame bun. It was still bright, and there was plenty of time before the evening rush began, when traffic became too gridlocked to cross the roads without ducking dangerously between lorries and roaring buses. We arrived at Parel station, where an overhead clock read 17:35. Rush hour. Mumbai's light skies and chattering birds had been misleading. Thinking it was still late afternoon, we were now face to face with the one thing that we had been told to avoid. Sickly excitement washed around my stomach. Hundreds of people swarmed across the footbridge and thundered down the stairs to the platform, but swerved off to the left and right before they reached the bottom. The reason soon became clear. Halfway down the stairs, in the middle of a landing, an elderly lady with her hair pulled into a walnut-sized bun had spread out a square of dirty cloth. Her chappals were placed to one side, and she sat cross-legged, cleaning her teeth with one finger. She faced the oncoming masses with an air of enviable nonchalance. In the same manner that cars avoid cows that hold up traffic, everyone curved around her, but not one person raised a question or their temper. Pigeonholing in India is futile. For every rule, there are 100 exceptions. But Indians exercise great levels of tolerance, mainly of each other's idiosyncrasies. Their astounding levels of acceptance go some way to explaining how millions can live in such close quarters without daily outbreaks of civil unrest. At the bottom of the stairs, the crowd was already 4 people deep. At the back of the platform, a man was cutting and serving slices of papaya, the color of sunsets. Bottles of chili powder lined the side of his stall, which reminded me of the guavas my grandma used to eat with lemon juice, so I bought a slice and rejoined the crowd. A full 2-meter gap stood between the crowd and the edge of the platform, so we darted in front and parked ourselves in the space. After the Goan coffee incident, this was the second foolish move of our trip. A tick-tick, tick-tick, tick-tick drew nearer, and train 20 came into view. The crowd tensed in anticipation, like a row of runners waiting for a starter pistol. When the nose of the engine reached the platform and the sound of braking and creaking grew deafening, moustaches and sweat-sodden polyester shirts appeared in the doorways, looming larger and higher before they suddenly leapt into the air from the moving carriages and hit the ground running. Before the train had stopped, hordes of men rained down upon us with monsoon force, while the rows behind began to heave forward, reaching over our heads to grab the doorways and haul themselves in. The papaya was knocked from my hand and slithered down my leg. Once again, the rule was simple: attack or be attacked. Crushed between satchels, stale armpits, and wet skin, spitting out mouthfuls of coconut oil-flavored hair, we managed to push forward and fell into the middle of the carriage. Bent double and wheezing, I saw that beyond the human barrier at the doorways, the carriage had spare seats. The crush was just another one of India's little mysteries. Sitting down, I wiped the papaya from my knee where a fly was rubbing his legs with glee, and looked around at fellow passengers. Their angst was always short-lived. Moments earlier, they'd shoved, kicked, elbowed each other in the face, and now they sat shoulder to shoulder, snoozing, stabbing at phones, or staring at me. I stared back. Most became bored and looked away. A couple brought out phones and took photos. It was fair enough. If we could waltz around photographing their daily life, why shouldn't they? As we neared CST, the crowd had dwindled, and I was now standing in the doorway with both arms looped around the pole, invigorated by the blast of air. But something looked wrong. The train had come into the station and was already sailing by the platform when pockets of men appeared, inching their way towards the edge, crouched low, satchels over shoulders. Before the train had stopped, they took flying leaps into the doors, desperate to bag seats for the train's next journey. Those last seconds became a blur, but Passepartout was rugby tackled by a mouse of a man wearing bell-bottoms. He threw himself through the doorway while I ducked my head and rolled onto the platform, hoping my skull would not be stamped if it even survived the impact. Checking for blood and bruises, we brushed ourselves off and gripped hands through the crowds with an air of triumph. So that was rush hour.
Monisha, your book, the genesis of your book and of Tim's book is very different, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about the genesis for yours. In a way, there's a certain drive that is evident in you to rediscover this country you knew as a child. You'd moved to India and you hadn't had a great experience and you went back. So I was curious to know, first of all, what drew you back? Why this process of rediscovery? But second, also, why do it through the process of train travel?
Just as a little brief background, I sort of born and grew up in England, but I had lived in India very briefly when I was 9. My parents moved back for a couple of years. It wasn't meant to be a couple of years, it was meant to be for good, but we soon discovered that it didn't suit us anymore, and we went back very quickly. And it was about 20 years since we'd left that I read an article about how India's domestic airlines could now connect 80 cities. And I was quite curious by this, because when we lived in Madras, there was Indian Airlines, and I think Jet Airways had just started. And I was just quite taken by the fact that these airlines could cover so much, and so I pulled up a map. But underneath this map was this wonderful embroidered line all the way around, which I soon realized was actually the railway lines. And so very quickly, this idea of traveling around by 80 planes suddenly became 80 trains, and that's how the sort of idea for the book came. But I'd also, at that point, been very keen to go back to India and sit properly, because I'd really only been to Madras and Hyderabad, where my mum's family are from, and I'd never even been anywhere further north than Bombay at the time. And so I wanted to come back and see it properly, and I knew that the trains would, A, be a cheap way to do it, and B, be probably the best way to get close to people. I mean, if you fly, you sit next to maximum 2 people, and you can't really speak to more than 2 people, and you see nothing. Whereas with the trains, you can move around, you can sit in doorways, you are a part of their life immediately, and it seemed like the most viable option.
And did you have particular memories of the Indian Railways from your little time here as a child?
I did. My brother went to boarding school in Kodaikanal, and so, and in fact, it was very difficult for me, because we came back as a family, and suddenly my brother, who was 13, went to Kodaikanal. I was in a school I felt very much like a fish out of water. My dad actually went back to England quite quickly for various reasons, and so it was just me and my mum. And I hated Madras, I hated my school, I hated where I was, and to go and see my brother was a big deal, and it meant getting the Pandian Express. So for me, trains were an escape. It was going to Chennai Egmore Station, well, Madras Egmore, meant getting out of Madras, going to see my brother, and I was always very excited by getting into this berth, and I knew that I would fall asleep and wake up and it would all be better.
Yeah. And Tim, your process is in a way much more accretive. I mean, you describe how you had kept notes about your train journeys in Italy over the years, and there's just kind of, there was one long essay for Granta, I believe, that you accumulated part of it in, and then you built the book out of your notes over all these years. And you also mentioned in the book, in fact, it's very interesting that your first sight of Italy was on a train. So I was wondering if you could sort of describe the genesis for this idea of sort of writing about Italy through its train systems.
Yeah, am I audible? Yeah. I want to say first that I was actually arrested briefly on the Bombay commuter train because I was totally unable to get on the train. So I got on a carriage where there was some space and didn't kind of really take on board that there was space because it was first class. At which I was hauled away after a little while by 2 officials. And they said, we thought English people were more civilized than this. You know. So I don't know how much, I think it was quite a few rupees. Anyway. No, the train book, I've lived in Italy 32 years now. About 20 of those years I commuted between Verona and Milan, which is about an hour and a half, depending on what kind of train you get. Funnily enough, the time hasn't changed in 20 years. And very slowly I became aware that all the infinite complications of ticketing, the way delays happen, of the kind of people who travel in certain ways on trains, like the wave of immigration, which very much changed the train experience. Because one's first meeting with people immigrating into Italy was always on trains. I think trains is almost a place where you sense the way in which you belong to a society, whether you're first class, whether you're second class, why you're traveling on this train, whether it's a fast train or a slow train, how you sit in the train, how you deal with everybody in the train, you know, whether you're buying your season tickets and so on. So I just began to find that it was a very amusing way of sort of unfolding the mystery that is the country. I mean, I'm sure you could do the same thing in the UK, certainly. You could definitely understand the sort of sad madness of the Thatcher-Blair period by just looking at English ticketing. So it was just a fun way of getting at a body of information that...
And there's a way in which, I mean, maybe more so than any other travel, but that train travel becomes, you know, it inevitably becomes a prism through which you see the world. The train becomes the prism through which you see the world. I mean, I doubt you can say that for sort of airline travel, or maybe not even for car travel, but the vehicle itself in which you're traveling becomes your link and therefore your means of understanding the world around you.
Trains are extraordinary in that sense that you are on the ground but not touching the ground. You're moving terribly rapidly from A to B but actually seeing everything between. And you're always traveling on the same rails, which is very much like the way I tend to think. So there is that kind of weary sense of repetition as well. One of the interesting aspects about Italy and trains is that trains came to Italy just before the unification of the country, and they were understood immediately to be a political weapon of unification or division. So the Italian nationalists were very much encouraging train building, and the Austrians were just building trains inside their territories as military moves and so on. The Pope in particular excommunicated trains in 1842 or something like that, because he said, if people can travel rapidly from one place to another, they will not really know who they are anymore. They will not be controlled by their priests and wives. People will start to have double lives. And he condemned rapid travel of any variety. And you can see how right he was, you know. It was, I mean, he understood it perfectly. I know so many Italian professors who have a job in one town and a woman in the other and a wife in the third and so on and so forth. Trains facilitate these things.
And a priest in the fourth.
Yeah. Stations are also, I think one of the fascinating things is thinking about how a station plugs into a town and how the town relates to the station. And the way the station is the moment where most of us face the moment of maximal denial of poverty is when, certainly in Europe, obviously it's very different in this country, but in Milan, for example, the moment when you have to be listening to some headphone to nice music and forgetting that there are a lot of people cold and possibly hungry and maybe even dying on the street is when you go through Stazione Centrale, because you get this total contact between real poverty and real bourgeois, middle class hurry. So it's terribly important to get through the station fast.
I mean, it seems interesting, you mentioned this in your book, sort of the railways as political project, about how in Italy during the Risorgimento, the railway system was used to bind the country together. And in a sense, I mean, the railways was a political project even in India. I mean, the Raj laid down the rails just so that they could keep control and, you know, suck as much economic wealth out of the country as possible. I was wondering whether that moment has passed in a sense, whether the moment of railways as nation builder has exhausted itself in both these countries. I mean, Monisha, has the railways as a unifying spirit, has that ceased, do you see, in India, or?
No, I don't think so. I think I think it's still very much alive, actually, to be honest. I don't know. It's difficult to say, actually, because I was quite taken by all the problems that happened with Dinesh Trivedi back in May, with him saying that, you know, you do need to increase the fares and you need to put something back into it because it has largely been neglected by people. And, you know, he was right to have said what he did, and to be attacked for saying you're depriving these people of this was wrong, because actually I found that the people who didn't pay were the poorest of people.
Right.
And ticket inspectors would rarely bother to even go through those classes. And it is a very unifying pace. There's no two ways about that.
Because I would say, I would possibly argue that in Italy it's slightly different. I mean, you talk about this a lot, is the fact that the railways has somehow managed to separate the classes in a way that hadn't happened before. So there's, for example, the fresh air, the people who travel by the fast arrow trains are of a certain class, and there's a distinct difference in the way in which the railways perceives the Italian population.
Well, these things are terribly complicated. One of the things I said at the beginning is that one can understand Italian social policy through the train pricing system. Basically, there have to be cheap trains for people to get to work and for people to go home at the weekend when they study in a different part of the country. There's a very social sense that trains have to do that. But because those tickets are very cheap, they can't pay for anything. And because the government has no money, they can't pay for anything either. So one has a complete division between fast trains, which have had a massive investment in Italy. I mean, an investment, 135 billion euro in Italy have been spent Italy now has the fastest trains in Europe. Milan to Rome in 2 3/4 hours, 2 3/4 hours. It's simply astonishing. And that has simply divided up poor people and so on. But funnily enough, also ordinary working people from sort of more business representative traveling people. The whole thing is, the whole development at the moment is quite fascinating, especially when you see somebody who decides to get on a fast train without having paid. And that's wonderful, because if the train doesn't stop between Milan and Rome, you are guaranteed to get to Rome.
Right.
So you can do your 500 kilometers. You're going to get there. There's nothing they can do about it. So once you're on the train, and lots of people are now doing this, and then there'll be all kinds of trouble. But if they don't have any money at all, how can they pay the fine? And they're not going to go to jail. So.
Yeah. I mean, we'll get in a bit to the railways as a reflection of national character, but it's almost in a sense the railways also reflect the way in which the state interacts with its people. Tim, you talk about how it's very common to sort of find a certain glee among Italians the minute a state official is either humiliated or sort of, offended. Whereas, Monisha, you talk about the railways existing within this thicket of bureaucracy. I mean, I remember the chapter where you go to buy your ticket in Paharganj. I mean, it's reflective of exactly what the Indian state does to its people and how it interacts with its people. Is there, I mean, I'm trying to get at this larger question of what you could learn about the Indian state, the Indian government, what you in particular learned, and how it interacts with the people who are supposed to be its citizens.
The Indian government?
Yeah, and the Indian state, I mean the bureaucracy, the machine of administration.
I don't know, I think I was very reluctant to comment on that, but I mean, it rots from the top down like a fish. I mean, it really does, and you can see it at every single level, even from, people trying to, like you were saying, people who get on the train without the tickets. I was on a Duronto train and they don't stop, and it was a train from Pune to Delhi, and it's 21 hours, and as soon as the people had got on, the guy said, there are no berths, what do you expect him to do? And they would walk along behind him with 500 rupee notes slotted between fingers, and in fact, my photographer, we had got tickets, we were just double booked, ended up sleeping in a laundry cupboard after paying the guy 500 rupees for it, which was actually more than what his ticket would have cost down in the bottom end. But I saw it. I saw it at every single level, and I think it's just going to be near impossible to get rid of.
I think, can I just say, I think trains are a very tricky moment where we always have to sacrifice an individual impulse towards just getting from A to B in my car to the more socially viable and sustainable idea that I arrive at a station and get taken there. The problem is that in order to do that, which obviously saves vast amounts of carbon dioxide emissions, and also enormous amounts of negative mental activity driving.
Yeah.
I mean, how Indian drivers just survive psychologically, I don't understand yet, because it's difficult enough where I live. But in order to do that, then, we have to get people to agree to go on these trains, which means they have to be priced in a way that they can be paid for. And we all know the problem is that a train investment is a truly vast investment. And that lots of people anyway are going to use their cars unless you penalize the cars. So around the question of trains, there's a whole issue of whether a democratic government is just going to constantly back down to a car lobby. In England, it's a very, very big issue at the moment, or whether they're genuinely going to offer to the people a way of traveling that is possible. In Italy, they've offered rich people and better off tourists, I think, some of the most wonderful trains that could possibly exist. And at the same time, vast numbers of commuters around Milan and Rome are traveling carriages with, which are not, that they are better than the trains here, but they're still full of fleas and...
Yeah, I mean, I can think of, there's, of course, several advantages in trying to think of train travel and trying to assess the nation through the travel. But I would think one of the biggest advantages is possibly the fact that because tickets are priced so cheap, there's an impression that when you get onto a train, you meet the people of the country with a capital P, so the people who, from all walks of life, from every class and social level. And I know this sometimes, I know in your particular case, when you travel the Maharaja, the luxury train, sort of the conflict between classes and the idea of Indian poverty came up repeatedly. And
especially the fact that when I got on that train, out of, I think it was 39 passengers, I was the only Indian who wasn't employed on board.
Right.
It was very striking, especially because, you would pull into probably the smaller stations, which is where the train parks up when you do your daily tours, and that was where kids would just arrive in hordes, and they'd be, like I described in the book, pressing their faces against the windows, while people from Surrey are getting very upset about it and saying, "Oh, darling, just don't look, just don't look, turn the other way, it's fine." And it was quite painful to see, actually.
Yeah. Tim, I was wondering whether we could request you at this point to maybe do a little reading from your book.
Okay. I'm going to give you a little reading about not wanting to meet people on trains. My book is made up a lot of long commuter journeys and so on, where obviously one grows weary of meeting people. And obviously one of the things that's happened over the last 20 years is that technology has allowed us to, not meet anybody at all if we don't want to. I'm going to read two little bits. This is just a little moment on a train in Milano Centrale station in the evening. And then I'm going to read a little bit in honor of the Dalai Lama, I'm going to read a little bit about trains meditation. There are people who want to be on their own, to mark out their own territory and be quiet there. And there are people who are eager to invade that territory and to sit close to someone else. There seem to be a disproportionate number of the latter in Italy. You sit in an empty compartment, in a whole carriage of empty compartments, in a whole train of empty carriages, and someone comes banging in and sits next to you. Once, during a strike, not unusual, I found a completely empty intercity at Milan station. A ghost announcement said that the train might leave in 2 hours' time, but this could not be guaranteed. The voice apologized for any inconvenience. Having no inclination to find myself a hotel, I decided to sit in the train and read. I chose a carriage halfway down the long platform. Since it was an intercity, there were compartments. Suddenly, a man was tugging open the slide door to join me. A rather sad, lanky, middle-aged man in a grey raincoat with a slack, worried mouth and thick spectacles. He had a huge suitcase. The sort of suitcase that has you wondering where on earth is its owner going and for how long? And are these all his worldly possessions? Is he a refugee? With some effort, this man swung the suitcase up onto the luggage rack, sat down, brushed imaginary crumbs from his trousers, looked at me, smiled, and began, I knew I couldn't stop him, to talk about the strike, about a difficult change of trains that awaited him in Venezia Mestre, about the impossibility of ever knowing what would happen in Italy even when you began the most banal of journeys. Wasn't that so? It's an interesting thing how often Italians like to refer to the country as if it were foreign to them and inhabited by people who are inexplicably unreliable. I barely nodded. Ecco il capotreno, he suddenly shouted, the train captain, and he jumped up and hurried out of the compartment and down the corridor to talk to a man in a smart cap walking along the platform. This was my chance. Furtively, I picked up my own small bag, I headed the other way up the carriage and pushed through the 2 connecting doors to the next carriage. I must have walked through 4 completely deserted carriages going towards the locomotive before choosing another compartment. Since the electricity in the train hadn't been turned on, I was looking for a place where one of the big floodlights high up in the station outside would give me enough light to read by, even through grimy windows. Here. Good. I sat down. For perhaps 10 minutes I read. I was happy. The truth is, I really don't mind sitting on an empty train for a couple of hours reading, if the book is good enough. It doesn't matter where you read it, does it? There are times when I've even welcomed train delays. After perhaps 15 minutes, with a sudden wrenching of the compartment's sticky sliding door, breathless and anxious, the same man appeared. "There you are," he cried, and sat down. And he resumed his conversation. He began to tell me what the capotreno had said, that the train would be leaving, but only when they found a co-driver, that they were having trouble finding a co-driver because of the strike. As for Venezia Mestre, heaven only knows, he said. His last train for some mountain destination departed at 8:15. Who knows where I'll be sleeping tonight, he said. He seemed very pleased with this melodramatic reflection. Then glancing up at the luggage rack, he asked, "Where's my suitcase?" I shook my head. You left it in the other carriage." "What other carriage?" The man had not realized that he was now 4 carriages nearer to the locomotive. "Oh," he squinted at me. "I knew something was odd," he said. But why on earth did you move?" "I want to be alone," I told him. Alarmed, he jumped up and hurried back down the train to reclaim his suitcase. For a moment, it crossed my mind he might be a ghost. He haunted this train, even when it was parked for days in empty sidings. And that would explain why he was so desperate for company. Taking no chances, I moved again, this time into the first class. They cannot fine you for being in the first class on a second-class ticket until the train actually starts moving. I felt sure this was a second-class ghost. There is some more serious material in the book from time to time, but perhaps longer section. I'm just going to read a tiny section, as I said, a sort of reflection on train and mind and reading. I really feel that, I read quite a lot, and possibly at least half of what I've ever read in my life I've read on rails. So this is just a little moment, a much shorter piece from, I occasionally go to Vipassana meditation retreats. So this is why Dalai Lama got mentioned. This was a moment in a retreat in a place called Maroja, which is high, high, high above Lake Como, about 1,500 meters. The meditation center in Maroja is high up in the mountainside, looking across the great valley that sweeps down from the alpine peaks to Como. No train will ever reach up here. But in the long hours of silence, beginning at 4 a.m. and through until 8:30 in the evening, you occasionally hear the distant whistle of a locomotive as it strains up the valley to Sondrio or rushes down to Morbegno and Bellano. Why do trains still whistle these days? To warn people at a road crossing or approaching a country platform? Hearing that whistle, my mind would stray from my meditation. It is always such a struggle to keep the mind focused on the present moment, on the breath and the flesh, as it is. This whistle should have warned me that my attention was slipping, and instead it drew me into another world. Cross-legged at the back of the room, behind a dozen others, I began to follow the train down the valley towards Morbegno and beyond, trying to remember the names of the stations, Colico, Varenna, Lecco. These trains are driven, I thought, like the mind, by electric current. And at once I was imagining all the pylons and the wires running down the valley, creating a path, a network that was separate from the landscape, so that we could pass through the landscape at great speed. As thoughts also hurtle by so fast, but are rarely in contact with reality. The mind likes to move on rails, I decided, after a couple of days in Maroja. Always the same old reflections and anxieties and obsessions, one leading to the other with great predictability. The same switches, the same buffers, the same termini you never get beyond. Gallipolis of the mind. The hours passed, the train whistled. How many times a day? 5. I thought of the earth under the sleepers and the flesh beneath these thoughts, and I tried to conceive of the meeting point where the steel weighs down on the soil and the idea meshes with a tangle of nerves and veins in your head. The train of thought rattles by with a shrill whistle. Was there a man on board early that morning, I wondered, who had shat in his pants, or a woman snoring garlic breath over her neighbors, or a student reading St. Thomas Aquinas? No doubt people were speaking on their phones, so that radio waves flew back and forth from the train as it clattered down the valley, messages reaching out all over Lombardy, all over Italy, all over the world perhaps, why not? How hard it is when you really try to imagine everything that might be going on a single train, everything in constant motion, the wheels on the rails, the curtains flapping beside an open window, the capotreno moving down the carriage, the gypsy boy one step ahead of him, getting out of one door and climbing back in another when the official's back is turned, the businessman's fingers on his keyboard, the actors in a film that a student is watching on her iPod, as the train goes into and out of tunnels beside Lake Como, where the sun sparkles on the water in dazzling and perpetual motion. The stiller you sit as a meditator, the more you are aware of the infinite movement inside mind and body.
I believe we have about 12 minutes left, so maybe we'll open the floor up to questions for Monisha and Tim. There are mics floating around, so you could just put your hand up and somebody will come to you. Yes.
Yeah, I do live in England.
What do you think is the difference that you felt regarding the people when traveling on London trains and here in India?
It's very simple. We don't speak to each other in England. Quite honestly, we don't. If you I mean, I get the tube from Finchley Road on the Jubilee line, and I always get in the same carriage, generally get in with the same people. We don't make eye contact. We will never speak to each other unless there's ever, you know, a wasp. That's the one time when people always unite, when, you know, you can all see it, and then everyone will smirk a little bit, maybe, and then go back to their books or their papers. But, I mean, I could never have done this book in England. It just wouldn't have worked, because people don't interact in the same way. And we are so self-contained, sort of borderline quite insular, that it was really, it's a completely different world on the train.
Have you
scene.
started talking to your fellow passengers more after you went back from
Do you
India?
know, the first train that I did when I got back, I went back to see my parents in Birmingham, and I just nattered endlessly to the guy who was sitting next to me. And he did actually comment and say, oh, I don't normally sort of talk to people at length about this. I said, I've just come off 80 trains in India. And I said, it's very normal to me. And the thing is, though, I find that the minute you start to do that, it just takes one person and you have a domino effect. And we'll all sort of come out of our shells and start chatting. So it's not that we are such terrible people, it's just that we need someone to sort of do it first, and then we're fine.
Yeah, okay.
Well, don't you think that basically that people desire to shut themselves up a lot, and now they have the technology to do it. I mean, they can talk to somebody they know, and so on and so forth. They can have the headphones on. One interesting thing I noticed is that the compartments, they really encourage conversation, because if you're stuck in a compartment for 6 or 8 hours with somebody, sooner or later the battery on your laptop runs out, and you know, people are going to start talking and even sharing food and so on. But it seems to me the whole pressure of the modern zeitgeist is actually to eliminating contact.
Yeah. Although, I mean, in Italy, you also find that as you go, I mean, there's a section where you go to Sicily, and you discover that people from the south are more, you know, possibly more convivial, you know, this whole sharing of food, and almost as in an Indian train, in fact. I mean, that seems to come through in that chapter.
Yeah, I think the thing is that the train traveling south was a much slower train, and they still have compartments on those trains. Because one of the things they've done in the north of Italy is almost completely eliminate the compartment. You see, the compartment requires that people actually trust to sit in a small space with people they don't know. And more, nobody wants to take this risk. So the carriages have to be big and open so that we can all control each other. Down south, they still have compartments. The trains are much slower. The journeys are long, because the south of Italy is quite long.
Sure.
And so eventually everybody's talking. Of course, it's great fun, but not if you plan to work on the journey, you know.
Yeah, I was going to ask, given your proclivity to read on trains, I mean, do you prefer the open plan carriages or the compartments that may force social company on you at some point?
The trains I travel on normally in the north of Italy are all open.
Okay.
But there is a lot of conversation on the commuter train, because great groups of people, and this is very unlike England, great groups of people will get on the trains to Milan, and they're all using their mobiles to find out where they are on the train, and then they all meet, and then it's, you know, talking about referees' decisions at the weekend and scandals, a penalty not given in some big game, and politics and so on. Yeah, so there's a lot of conversation.
Okay.
I use earplugs a lot.
Yeah.
I always put my earplugs on when I get on a train. So.
I used to actually wear my iPod without music in sometimes,
I don't
just to
have
stop
an iPod.
people.
More questions? Yes, Jeet, over there. Yes. I'm calling on you.
I think he had his hand up.
Sorry?
I don't think he had his hand up.
The mic coming to you.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Don't speak to each other. She made a very interesting comment just now that while we are in the underground, we don't talk to each other and don't speak to each other. Why is it so? Why don't they talk to each other? Or were they always like that? Or is it after the world wars that they grew so quiet?
I think we're just a miserable bunch. So no, No, but like I said, it's not, I don't think it is that we don't want to speak to each other. It's just that it does take a couple of people to do it. But that's just the nature of how it is. People do interact on tubes. From time to time, like I said, if something unites you, then people will chatter. But for the most part, it's just part of your daily life. You get in, you get off, you get to work.
But train journeys and when you're on your journey, you're going lovely long trips. When you go on a lovely long trip, you might want to talk to somebody. But when you do the same train trip every morning and you have a little bit of work to do.
It's because you have to do that journey. So often people, especially on London tubes, people will be doing bits for work, they'll be reading, they'll be going through the Metro paper or something. It's A to B. You have to just get there. It's not the journey that they're enjoying. Well, I said at the beginning, we're a miserable bunch. That's probably the answer.
You put any other people, the Spanish, the French, the Italians, of course, as I was saying, Indians and Pakistanis would even ask each other how many children do they have, and is it their first marriage or the second one. But the English people just simply do not speak to each other. And what I also noticed was that they
Maybe
don't
they
want others to
say.
speak.
There you go.
Maybe they have nothing to say.
No.
Not enough children to talk about.
That's certainly not true. We get some of the best books written by English authors over centuries. So they have a lot to say, but why? Why don't they talk to each other?
Well, I guess they've got plenty to say in the books because they're so taken aback by how other people behave on trains that they feel it's worth writing about.
Well, trains are definitely, as I said at the beginning, a place where the whole question of how you belong is very clear. I mean, there were, for example, there was a period in Italy, the period of African immigration in Italy, which began after I arrived, probably around 1990. And suddenly you get great groups of African black immigrants on the train. And obviously a whole different conversational world, a very, very loud. And they're defining themselves in groups. Basically what the white middle class business commuter does is he wants to really step out of his house and into his office. And the space, everything is done by either the technology of headphones and so on, or mobile phones or laptops. Everything is done actually to eliminate the journey. The journey doesn't exist, and we must have no contact with the people around us. And if we speak, it's not that they don't speak, they're speaking endlessly on the phone to somebody else who's not there.
Monisha, I was wondering, in fact, you were on the Maharaja and there were English tourists there on the train. Were they speaking to each other there? Is it just the context of the train that matters?
Yes, we did all speak to each other.
Okay,
on
well,
that
so,
one, yeah.
it's not inherent in the English psyche. I think it's just it's a train that matters. Yes, there's a question over here.
Hello. My question is for Monisha. You wrote, you're obviously an...
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Breaking up.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You're obviously, you're a person of Indian origin, but you're British, and you've written the book as a British person. But did you find sometimes that your ethnicity was an advantage, or was it a disadvantage for doing the kind of traveling?
It had its benefits because I could slide sort of in and out of personalities as and when I wanted to. By and large, I found that people were actually very, very nice to me as soon as they found out where I was from and what I was doing. And I got a lot of help from people, especially I ended up in a compartment with 3 men from Delhi to Madras, and it was a 30-hour journey. And I remember getting in and being quite panicky about the fact that I had to share these close confines with them. And I was very English. I put my book up and I didn't want to speak to them. But they were very curious about what I was doing with this big backpack by myself and this big sheaf of tickets. And they ended up actually organizing a trip to Assam and putting me up in the government house there. And I think they were very excited about the fact that they had someone who was Indian, but not Indian, who was in their eyes, selling their country by writing a book about it. And they were very proud that I wanted to take my knowledge of India and the railways back to England. And I think that definitely helped, without a doubt. I do wonder sometimes if I had been sort of white and traveling by myself, how much people would have dealt with me in the same way.
Over here.
Hi. India and Italy are the two countries I go back to regularly. And isn't it really about attitudes towards being alone? Because I'm always struck by, actually, in very many ways, how similar Italy and India are with regard to things like food, sharing food. And if you're alone, it's almost seen as a crisis, and you'll be rescued from it. And that's what's so marvelous about traveling on trains. I mean, yesterday, on my way up from Mumbai, by the end of the journey, I'd made an auntie, an uncle, and I was invited to a wedding.
Lucky you.
And that's it, you know, you're never, yeah. I mean, you're never alone, whether you want to be or not. And I think I'm going back to answering the lady's question about the English. The thing about the English is that they don't want to be alone. It's just that they weren't initiated. So if someone talks to them, there's that kind of anxiety of getting it wrong or being embarrassed. They're rescued from that. But of course, they want to talk. They don't want to be alone, and it's quite.
But surely what's really changed is you're never alone now because you have your mobile phone. You're just never alone, so that everybody's just there texting to people who are not there, so that nobody actually meets each other. I mean, the mobile phone has completely destroyed communication between strangers, because why would you talk to a stranger if you can talk to your mum about when to put the pasta on, you know, about what time I'll be back, and it's amazing how many conversations are just constantly unpacked on mobile phones. I mean, you know, an anthropologist now just sit there with a tape recorder and listen. I listened to one incredible guy for about 2 hours ringing up everybody about his divorce. You know, everybody except the wife, obviously. and the thing he kept repeating constantly to everybody, un inferno durato 10 anni, a 10-year inferno, you know. And he just kept repeating this expression. I was thinking, well, 10 years is not very much, is it? You know, it's quite a short marriage, really. So, but I do think the mobile is, the Italians have to be together, it's true. I got an email from my daughter today saying, Dad, you know, you've been away, Mum's also away. I need to be with someone all the time. So they need to be with people, but the mobile's made that possible, and they don't need to meet each other anymore. So only poor people who really can't afford a mobile have to get invited to weddings and so on.
On that note, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Monisha, for an excellent conversation.
Much. I'd like to thank on behalf of the organizers, Tim Parks, Monisha, Rajesh, and Samanth Subramanian. And we have little gifts for all of 3 of you. Thank you, sir.